All right, well, let's get started. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Loudoun County Public Library and our program tonight, The Real Housewives of Colonial America. I'm Lorraine Moffat, one of the programming coordinators for the library, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Diane Helentjaris. She's a writer whose writing features artists, women, nonconformists, and other often overlooked gems. Ivy in America, #2 in her Ivy series, will be coming out in August. Her historical novel, The Adventure of Ivy O'Neill, won the 2024 Maryland Writers Association Novel Competition in the Historical Romance category. Diane also publishes regularly in Middleburg Life. She's an active crafter and a previous artist in residence at Russ Library, and early in her career, she was a former public health physician. Welcome back, Diane.
Thank you. Thank you, Lorraine. So I'll get started. I'm really happy to be here, and I appreciate this opportunity to talk about life in colonial America for women. What I'm going to talk about today will reflect mostly an emphasis on the Middle Atlantic, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, etc. And that's because that's the area that I've researched the most. And in fact, both of my grandmothers descend from settlers to Virginia in the early 1600s. So I'm interested in that area in general. And what I'm going to talk about are the women and girls in the period from when the first non-Indigenous women arrived in what would become the 13 American colonies up until the onset of the Revolutionary War. So it's only going to go up to 1775. Now, when you figure out who the first women were, you have the indigenous women who've been here for thousands of years. The Norse people are believed to have brought some women with them, possibly around the year 1003. St. Augustine, Florida, which we don't often think about, but it was settled in 1565 and had free and enslaved African women, Spanish women, and is the first enduring European settlement on the continent. Men came to Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, and that would be the first men in the American colonies, and women followed shortly after. There was a Mistress Forrest and Anne Burras in 1608. So the period I'm talking about is 1608 to 1775. There were a number of legal statuses for women. That would be, you might have free and enslaved African women. You might have free women of all races, indentured women. You could have single, so-called spinster women, married and widowed. And some of the information that I'll give today might let you in on why you might want to be a widow of all the possible statuses. Now, I want to talk about the shape of the lives of females and the framework for what happens to most women in this time period is predicated by the law and by the church. For example, Virginia had an official state church. It was the Anglican Church, which later evolved into the Episcopalian Church here in America. There were patriarchal ideas from Europe that were transposed into the United States, and those combined with the realities of life here. There were constraints that did not occur in Europe. And so that really affected how far people could go with superimposing European ideas on this continent. There were no roads, except mostly pathways that were indigenous pathways that had been formed along game paths. There were no familiar buildings. There were no familiar foods. The animals were different, the crops, the flowers, and it made life all new. Now, here in the Mid-Atlantic, it was set up as a business proposition. And what that means is the colony was started, Maryland and tobacco, to make money. in large part, with a heavy dependence on tobacco. And tobacco is a really labor-heavy crop. So the first people to come over were the men, and predominantly men with very few women. So for instance, in Middlesex County, Virginia, the ratio in the early years of settlement of men to women was 6 to 1. There were 6 men for every woman. And by the 1680s, it had only risen to 3 to 1. So the women were outnumbered, which gave them, in some sense, some extra power, made their roles a little more fluid than they might have had in Britain or Europe. New England was different. New England was founded with a heavy emphasis on religion, and entire families came. It wasn't like a bunch of single guys coming over. It was an entire family often. They had lower mortality rates than in the Mid-Atlantic, and they had a strong patriarchal system. So the reason it's good, I think, to think about how our female forebears or our country's female forebears lived is it helps us understand how we got where we are now and how and why things can change. So I'm going to start off and talk about the typical situation for a woman from start to finish for a female. This is a picture of a woman and her child, her little girl. And I believe what they're talking about here with their gestures is that the woman is pregnant. Okay, you see the little girl pointing and the mom holding her hand over her belly. Pregnancy was different back then, for sure. There was contraception, there were barrier methods and herbal medications, and a common way babies were spaced was through breastfeeding. Breastfeeding reduces temporarily someone's fertility and helps space the babies out a little better than if they are not breastfed, if the moms are not breastfeeding. You might be surprised to know that premarital sex, in some sense, was accepted, and it certainly was not uncommon. And partly this was acceptable as a way to assure that couples were compatible before they ventured into marriage, and also to verify that the woman was indeed fertile because of the importance of heirs and family in helping with the labor of different properties and carrying on family names and inheritances and all that sort of stuff. So for instance, in Maryland, early on, half of the female immigrants, and we're talking in the 1600s, 1700s, went to the altar pregnant, okay? Half of them. And in New England, where they have a practice called bundling, which is still practiced in some Amish societies, which is couples who are getting serious, thinking about getting married, are allowed to spend the night together, fully clothed. They lie in bed. They might have a wooden plank inserted between them to discourage intimacy. And by doing this, they claim that it saved firewood, okay? They also, the talk was that it assured some privacy for the couple to have some time to talk together and see how well they got along. Well, it also at times led to pregnancy, with 30 to 40% of New England women pregnant at the time of marriage. Now, a term that you might have heard in old-time books is fornication. And what that means is that's consensual sex outside of marriage. So it's people who aren't married to each other having sex. And that was a sinful deal in New England. And the emphasis in the Chesapeake was more on the financial burdens if a child would come about because of this relationship outside of marriage. It would put a burden on the community as far as providing for that child. Both parties were liable if they were caught, quote, fornicating. In Maryland, it required 2 witnesses to take them to court or punish them, or confession of one. So this was an issue, and it was largely an issue because of the risk of illegitimacy. And that was known as bastardy in the laws. And there were legal liabilities in the Mid-Atlantic and religious issues in New England. And illegitimate kids were not uncommon. So sometimes there was a big push to find out who the father was so that they could be forced to either marry the woman that was considered the ideal or to provide for the children. Midwives might have to testify in court as to any knowledge they had of who the father was of the child, and people were punished. A woman could be fined 500 pounds of tobacco, which tobacco at the time was used as a stand-in for real money, coin and paper. A man could be required to build bridges or maintain bridges or build highways. And there is an example from Maryland of a master who made his servant pregnant. And when she had the baby, she was accused of letting her milk dry up. And because of that, she put the child at risk for not surviving. So she received 30 lashes for fornication and attempted child murder. And the man had to pay 700 pounds per year to care for the child. Childbirth and delivery, if you're a female baby and this is how you're going to be born, most of the time the women labored in a chair, as you see here, which actually used gravity to help with the delivery and was considered to be fairly comfortable. It was at the time 100% female event, childbirth. The woman who was going into labor would have her female family, friends over, and they would help her through the event. A midwife would deliver the baby. If there was no midwife, someone who might have more experience, had witnessed more births, might help her deliver. There were no male midwives delivering babies until maybe around the 1760s. And then in the upper classes, people who were fairly wealthy, they might be delivered by a man, and they called him a male midwife. And this is sort of the precursor to your OBGYN. And it was more common in urban areas. And the impetus for this was the invention of forceps, which helped deliver babies who might not have been readily birthable before because of their head size or this and that. The forceps were invented in the 1600s and kept secret by the family that invented them. But once the word got out, then the men, and most of the deliveries were by forceps when the men got into this. There were no successful C-sections till after the American Revolution, meaning C-sections where both the mother and the child survived. There were 0. So people would get together with their family friends and deliver. 20% of women died at some point in time from the complications of childbirth. Now, they'd had a fair number because contraception was so unavailable or not adequate. They had a fair number of children. The average was 7 to 8 to 10 children each. That's on average. Some women had 14 or more. People would begin having babies once they got married, which is in their early 20s, and typically have a child every 2 years until they were in their early 40s. Of those babies, so they had multiple exposures to giving birth and multiple risks attached to that. 10 to 30% of babies born died before they were 1. And what that meant was, in some cases, it wasn't uncommon, and this went on until the 1800s at least, to not name a child when they were born. to wait and see if it would survive, and they might be up to a year of age before they would name the child. Up to 40 to 50% of all children fail to reach adulthood, and that reflects issues with food quality, water contamination, infectious diseases, accidents, any number of things. So even though you might give birth to 10 kids, you might only have 5 who survive to adulthood. Now, the punishment for having a child out of wedlock, if you are an indentured servant, and an indentured servant is someone who has a contract, who has to work for another person for several years, and in exchange, at the end of that time period, receive some land and some tools, maybe some clothes in exchange for having worked for those period of time. If you were indentured, that was a legal bond. And if an indentured woman gave birth to an illegitimate baby, then her time was extended. And the child actually was considered indentured until they reached 21. You could be punished for bearing an illegitimate child with 30 lashes. Or there was, for instance, if you hid the birth of a bastard child, that was a capital crime. And if the baby died, you were at risk for execution. So there is a case of a woman named Elizabeth Green who was executed for infanticide. So there were certain crimes that were women were at risk for. Oops. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to go back with this. Okay, so once the baby's born and the baby's alive and it's a little girl baby, or if it's a boy, they're going to get swaddled. And this is, they would do it with strips of cloth. You know, we swaddle babies now. There's a feeling that a swaddled child, a young child will be more comfortable swaddled, they're happier, they're at peace. And so you can see in this picture, and this is, I think it's from France, she's swaddling the baby after she fed it. That's why her breast is exposed. She just swaddled the baby, or just fed the baby, and she's going to swaddle it. They were kept in diapers, okay, just like our children are, but these were cloth, and they were either linen or rags, depending on your financial circumstances. They were the old square folded into a triangle like they used in the 50s with the cloth diapers, but they didn't have any safety pins, so they were pinned together with straight pins. And occasionally they would add moss, sphagnum moss, to increase the absorbency, kind of like the nappies that British people knit for their children. Then after they're out of the, and they were kept in gowns, both boys and girls. After they were out of their gowns, then they were dressed like Mommy and Me, okay? Little girls were dressed in exactly the same clothes as the adults. They didn't have like kids' clothing styles. So you see this baby, and she's probably, I don't know, 2 or 3. It's hard to tell in some of these older paintings because they don't do a very accurate job of portraying children. But she's dressed like her mother's dressed. She's got the cap, she's got the lace collar, she's got the little sleeves, and she's got her apron. And this little girl, as you see, is dressed in an outfit that an adult girl could be wearing. Now, this picture shows a boy and a girl. And boys wore gowns the same as girls when they were younger. And then when the girls started wearing the Mommy and Me outfits, the boys would wear dresses as well. But their dresses, there was a difference if you paid attention. Like the dress that this boy has on is cut kind of like a man's waistcoat. It's a little more structured, cleaner lines, it's not gathered at the waist like the girls is. His shoes are a little different. And he's got a squirrel, which is a real boy thing to have. The girl has in her hand a silver teether. And what that is, that red tongue part that's at the bottom is a piece of coral that she could teeth on. So she's probably, she looks older than she probably is. Okay, she's probably still teething. And it has little silver bells to ring. So it's a rattle and a teething item. It's a pretty high class toy. Now, the reason the boys were kept in these gowns, they were kept in those dresses until they were breeched. And what breeched is that's when they got to wear pants. Okay. The little girl has no pants. People did not wear panties like we do now. And the boy, uh, think about it, having a younger child, like a 2 to 3 year old toddler, try to deal with um, the pants that the men wore at the time. They didn't have zippers, they didn't have Velcro, they had buttons, it was just really a pain. So it's easier just to have him be naked under there, and then he could do a better job with learning toilet training. There were no flush toilets while we're talking about toiletry. There was no running water. And they used chamber pots, which are stored under the bed at night, or they might have a chair with a chamber pot in it, or a privy, which is an outhouse. And the privies at the time, sometimes you'll see them with two holes where two people could go in together and use a privy, and even a privy that had like one or two adult size um, bench seats, and then a lower one for the child. So, I mean, you can see the mom's going in and she's going to take the kid and let the kid use the lower one. So by 4 to 5, the little boys should have been toilet trained, and then they get in, then they're breeched and they're in their pants, and then they start dressing like uh, little men. And there, there was an attitude that's expressed by this clothing of kids, and they were treated as little adults. There wasn't like that child psychology attitude that we have, or where we try to meet the kids where they are, and that just wasn't the deal. There was also a high rate of parental death. For example, in Middlesex County, Virginia, 48% of children lost one parent by age 9. So that means half of the children were orphaned as far as one parent by age 9, and by age 13, it was 60%. So it was very common to be raised, and remarriage usually happened quickly, just for economic and functionality reasons. So when people lost a spouse, they would really need to get remarried because there was so much labor involved with raising their families. So children were often raised by step parents. Little girls spent their time learning to do the jobs they were going to do when they were grown up. One of the things they learned was sewing. They might learn embroidery. They might learn, depending on their class, making samplers. And samplers were used as advertisements for their to their future husbands. Okay, their samplers would be done and displayed, and their beaux could come in and look at that and see what kind of a wife they might be. And the reason they would often do letters and alphabets, it wasn't so much to learn the alphabet as it was to learn the letters so that they could embroider their family name letters, initials, on their linens, so that if it were washed in a communal laundry, they could get sorted out and not lose it. As far as education, and this is hard to think about, there were no public schools at the time. In colonial days, to learn, children learned from tutors, they learned from their parents or other adults, or they might go to a private school. There was a distinction between boys and girls may well be illiterate and their brothers not. Or girls at times, and this went on, I think, until the 1800s even, where a girl might learn to read, but never learned to write. And the reason was there's an interpretation of some Bible passages where people need to be able to read the Word of God. And so they have to be able to read. And early on, for instance, in Virginia, the enslaved as well might be taught to read by either by being alongside the enslavers' children when they were learning, or be taught by the children, or often by the woman of the house how to read. But later, this was outlawed and considered dangerous after, I believe, the Nat Turner uprising. They thought it was a bad idea to educate their enslaved population. This is a colonial wedding. So a little girl grows up and she's going to get married. And you really want to get married because of the economics of the situation, and because you would otherwise have no way to take care of yourself, or it'd be very difficult. So that was the ticket, or the opportunity for a potentially better life, to marry up, to do well. Now, there was a high mortality rate. I guess if you haven't figured that out by now, people in colonial times, they faced a lot of risk. So according to one statistic, most marriages ended within 9 to 12 years. And that meant you'd be married more than once, quite often. You also needed your parents' permission to marry. You could not just decide, no matter how old you were, if you wanted to get married, you had to have your parents' permission. Now, this is the permission slip for my fourth great grandmother. Let's see. I think the fourth great grandmother was the one giving permission. Her name was Lydia Edwards King, and she was giving permission. This is in 1804, but it's the same style as went on earlier, for her daughter Nancy to marry David Via in Franklin County, Virginia. And the reason Lydia could give permission was she was a widow. Okay, and so she says that, "Sir, please to issue David Via license to marry my daughter Nancy, and in so doing, you will oblige your good friend." And then it gives some signatures, people. It has her signature and other people witnessing it. So as somebody said, women in colonial times ceased to exist as legal entities upon marriage. Okay? They were barred from acting alone, even with property you brought to your marriage. Okay? You were covered by your husband. So what you owned going into the marriage became your husband's. And he was the one that could make decisions. Now, a woman might be able to do a few things, like have a will written. She could pay taxes, and she was liable for her husband's debts, but she could not vote. She couldn't hold office. She could not serve in the militia or military, and could not serve on regular juries. She could serve on special women's juries that were set up to investigate crimes committed by women that involved the need to examine them physically. For instance, witchcraft, or to see if they had had a child recently, if they were being accused of having an illegitimate baby or killing a child, and that sort of thing. So those were special juries that a woman could serve on. But on a regular jury, no, she could not. When her husband died, she was expected to get 1/3 of his property as a dower right, but that was only for during her lifetime. And she could use the property, but then after that, it went to his other heirs. And if the children were already adults when her husband died, everything passed to them, and they were expected to take care of their mother. Okay. Women also as I said, cease their legal existence when they married. And there were also like a skewed treatment of women as far as adultery and these other things. And see, for now, adultery is largely a moral question or a family question. But at this time, these sort of activities were legal issues. And in English common law, and since we were an English colony, that meant here as well, a married woman was the only person who could commit adultery. Okay? By definition, a married woman having extramarital intercourse was an adultery. Now, there was no liability for a married man having intercourse with an unmarried woman. Both of those folks would be not liable for any crime at all or any problem. Indentured servants could not marry without their owner's consent. They could marry their owner, but they couldn't marry anybody else without consent. So I think we've talked a lot about legal issues and all that sort of thing. And this we want to talk about maybe something more in line with the Real Housewives of Hollywood or something. And so we'll talk about clothes. And there were some fantastic clothes during this time period, really fancy, elegant fabrics, satins, silks, linens, lace, natural fabrics that had exquisite craftsmanship, like in this lace, like this lady here. This is a 1766 portrait, and she's wearing just an exquisite lace cape. She's got, I think that's linen ruffles on her satin dress. And you can see her petticoat is split, showing it's a two-layered skirt, one underneath, and then she's got some mitts on. So most clothes at the time were made locally, either by the person who wore the clothes or by a tailor or somebody's daughter. Often the wives of tenants and overseers would make shirts and shifts for wealthier people. And in 1600s in Maryland, all classes wore similar clothes. There wasn't like a lot of hierarchy about, and only a few early on had better quality clothes from England. For the enslaved, the way it was often set up is that there would be an allotment of fabric for each slave at the beginning of the year. And that would be what had to last them for the entire year. And it would be given either to the enslaved person to make their own clothing, or some people didn't trust the enslaved persons to do the right thing, and so they would have somebody else make the clothing for them. But it was once a year. It was very poor quality fabric. It was often what's called Osnaburg, which is almost like a burlap fabric. And in Virginia, the information that's been given is that young children received nothing. They were often like, especially, I'm sure they had, well, they would just be naked during the warmer months. And the other thing that happened is they would wear hand-me-downs from their enslavers. And also at times they would wear livery, which is clothing in colors chosen by the enslaver to represent the family. Okay, so it's like racing silks. They might have the people who waited on them at their meals wear like purple and green, and everybody would match. The wealthy later on had multiple changes of clothing. Middling people might have several, and the poor people might only have one set of everything. All clothes were washed infrequently. It was torture to do laundry. It was very onerous. And the outer clothes, they dressed in layers and they're dressed in multiple pieces that were put together to make an outfit. So the outer clothes generally could not be washed. It's like dry clean only you really can't even dry clean them. So they would be spot cleaned. So this woman in Mr. Copley's painting, her satin petticoats, would not typically be washed. What she wore as her first layer would be. Now, the first layer was a shift, was typically linen. And you see this woman, she's a married woman, and I believe she's actually German. Okay, I couldn't find a good colonial one from America, but she's wearing a shift, and that's her nightgown. Okay, it goes down to just below the knees. People slept in them, but then in the daytime, they didn't take them off. They just put their other clothes on top of them. They might have a drawstring at the top, and it might peep out of their at the neck and at the elbows. And if you're paying attention, you'll start to see this, like in old movies, where they have people from the 1700s, all that. They had no panties, no underwear, no drawers. They also wore stays, and babies were put in stays, which are basically corsets made of bone or wood. They would be put in those when they were 6 months old. And for girls, they were in stays for the rest of their life. Boys stopped wearing stays when they were breeched, okay? And the stays were supposed to help their posture. And we'll explain some of that super erect posture that you see in some of these portraits. No respectable woman ever showed up in public without her stays, but they might loosen them up a little bit, if they had to do some physical work. Now, they also might wear hip pads, which gives you that kind of flattened, widened look at the hips. Like in this one, it's really exaggerated. And those could be worn for formal wear. They wore multiple skirts on top of their shift. And that practice went on up into the 50s. People wore multiple petticoats under those gathered skirts. So they did that. They had multiple petticoats. Sometimes the top one would be split. You could see what's underneath, like in this one. And then they'd have an apron. And these aprons are just purely decorative, these two. But other aprons were to protect the clothing, to try to keep them clean. The triangular piece is called a stomacher. And you see it kind of fill in the front of the dress. Oops. They had a modesty scarf. So the dresses were low cut. I mean, some of them were super low cut. And so they'd fill in, depending on the person's style, with like a gauzy or a lace or cotton, linen scarf to fill in the low cut area. And they'd often put like a flower, it could be a fake flower right in the middle as well. And that scarf was called a fichu. If they needed something to stay warm, they wore a mantle. They did not wear coats with sleeves. The men did. The only time, and I think it was later on, that the women wore kind of jackety things were when they were riding in riding costumes. But in general, they did not wear coats. They wore shawls, they wore cloaks, they wore mantles. And this lady has, it looks like a velvet mantle with a fur lining. So again, the dress was never washed. It was only spot cleaned. And clothing was recycled, upcycled, reused. And I don't know if you've ever done this. I remember as a little girl, my grandmother taking one of her slips. It was a cotton slip. And of course, it was a lot bigger than me, and cutting it down so that my mother could make a slip for me out of the fabric from her slip. So that's what was done with these dresses. And sometimes people get the sense that everybody in colonial times was real little because the only dresses to survive were tiny. Well, the reason they were tiny was they had been cut down and cut down and cut down and redone multiple times. You always go from a bigger size to a smaller size, but there were larger people living at the time. And you can see how now you don't know for sure if that's her shift or not, poking out at her elbow, the white with the lace, that might be her shift. And she's got a fan. Fans became increasingly popular in the South in the 1700s. And she's wearing a cap. So in the morning, you kind of wake up and you might be living in a place that looks like this. You know, we have houses like this here in Loudoun County, the same style from a long time ago. And it looks very much like what you see in Britain. And part of your job would be to keep the house clean, either by yourself, you know, depending on your economic situation, or for someone else if you were enslaved or indentured, or through servants. This is the other kind of property that people lived in. This one is one of the oldest plantations here in Virginia, and it was started in 1723. This is considered, in some records that I found, the oldest house in Leesburg, Virginia, where I live. It's about 1750, and it's a clapboard house. Now, it may well be log underneath. It may well also be what's called a covenant house. And what that means is when people bought land, when Leesburg was first developed, they would sign a paper that said that within 3 years, they were going to have a building built on the property. They didn't want to just have land turning over. And the building had to be a certain size. I think it was 16 by 20 feet, or 16 by, I think it is 16 by 20. So when you go around, you'll find properties with that size house on them. And that was the first house that was built. Sometimes they would then extend the house and use that first part as a kitchen or whatever. So they had to keep the houses clean and tidy. And there's a log house, so clearly a log house. And there's another one here in Loudoun County. This one in particular is in Waterford, and it's unknown exactly how old it is. Let's see. Now, some slaves or enslaved people, if they were kitchen workers, their living quarters were above the kitchen, or they may have a two-story laundry building and they live above the laundry. This is the stairs above the kitchen in Mount Harmon over in Maryland. This is the kitchen area. Now, this is to remind you of laundry. Urine was used in place of bleach, and you had to age the urine. So part of the deal for doing the laundry is first you had to prepare ahead and figure out how you were going to bleach your clothes. They also had some chemicals that they sold in towns that you could get. Here's a lady soaping linen. I really don't believe she looked that good when she did the laundry. And there's, by the same artist, I think it was a man who had a real romantic idea about laundresses. But she's using a little box iron. And sometimes some of those opened up and you put coals inside, or you might have an iron that you heated on the coals itself and then brought over. Usually they would work with two irons at once. One would be cooling as she ironed with it, and the other one would be heating up. This is what laundry day was like. What would happen is typically, and there's many ways to do this, but all of them involve like multiple stages of soaking the clothing in warm water overnight with a bag of ashes, which is lye, or the urine in hot water. And that would break down the grease and the dirt. And after that, they would then get lye soap and they'd scrub it. The thing on the lower right is a scrubber from 1756, I think. Then they would do what they called bucking it, which means scrubbing it by hand, folding it into a square, beating it with paddles. Just supposedly that caused the dirt to rise to the surface. I find that hard to believe, but that's what they said. And they'd use laundry bats or battledores, or a maiden is what they would call these sticks that they would beat their laundry with. After that, they'd rinse it again with a bluing agent, like indigo that might brighten the clothing. They would rinse it and hang it out to dry. They might have to starch it, and they could use potatoes, rice, or wheat to starch their clothes. And after to hang it out to dry, they could hang it on bushes or on clotheslines or lay it on the grass. And the sun would bleach it a little bit too. So that was what laundry day was like. Sometimes they met at a river, like here in the upper left. Now, that lamb looks cute. Women were expected to make their own cloth. They would use the sheared wool, clean it up, card it, spin it, weave it. And then as far as food preparation, there was no refrigeration in colonial times. Very, very wealthy people might have an ice house, which would be a big hole. I mean, 20 feet by 8 feet, where you had to have ladders to go down in it, just these huge pits that they would fill with river ice or pond ice. They might be in like a cave almost, like into the side of a hill. And that ice could last until the summer. Okay. And they would use that to help preserve their produce or meat. But for most people, large animals could not be slaughtered until the weather was cold enough for the meat to be kept outdoors, which meant that's why hog killing was usually a November, December activity. And then the meat would either be dried or smoked or eaten. You can see this is here in Loudoun County, and it is a smokehouse. If you look at the front on the right, there's only those two slits. That's it, I always wondered what that was, and I finally had to stop and ask. And there's a door on the first floor, and then on the side, there's a door on the second floor. And what that is, you'd go in the top door to hang your meat up, and you'd go in the lower door to add wood to the fire and smoke your hams. Now, this all looks very bucolic and cute and pleasant. And cows were a source for milk. Cows need to be milked twice a day. And that was almost always a woman's job, to be the dairy maid. And she would take the milk and put it in a milk house or a dairy. That's what they called these special purpose-built small buildings. Most of the milk was not drank, okay, or drunk. The milk was not used as a beverage. It was turned into butter and cheese because butter and cheese would last longer. So in this, number one, I've numbered this. Those are cheeses that are hung up high to kind of keep it out of the way of animals and critters. And number two is a cheese press. Number three shows you the stairs because the dairies all were sunk into the ground like 2 to 3 feet, which helped make them cooler. They were pretty much immaculate. People understood that they could not have insects in their milk. They really needed to take care of it. Number five is a butter churn, and number four are shallow bowls of milk that's cooling to let the cream rise. So I said they didn't have milk as a reliable drink, so they preferred alcohol. People drank a lot of alcohol then. They were very hesitant to drink the water. They thought it was contaminated. Someone posted at water pumps, "Death to him who drinks quickly." There's a real sense that alcohol was a lot safer to drink. So it was a woman's job, except for large money-making situations, to do the brewing. So women did cider, they distilled. It was women and servants and the enslaved. They made beer, cider, mead, ale, brandy, and whiskey. And in 1656, one of the quotes I have is an English traveler who complained that in Maryland and Virginia there was nothing in some parts but water and milk. And quote, they will be adjudged by their drink, what kind of housewives they are. Like this was just awful in his mind. So they would substitute a lot of things or try new things to make these alcoholic drinks. They would use spruce in place of hops. They'd use ground ivy. They'd use fruits, vegetables, corn, pumpkins, persimmons, molasses, all sorts of things to make their alcohol. Toasted bread, rye meal, wheat bran, ginger root, all that. So by 1770, the average adult white man drank about 7 shots of rum a day, or its equivalent, and the average adult white woman drank almost 2 pints of hard cider a day. And this is sort of sets up the scenario for what follows in the 1800s as the strong temperance movement, that led to prohibition. It was this dependence on alcohol at the time. But in colonial days, there's some period recipe books where a third of the recipe book is devoted to brewing recipes. This is a beer jug. Oops. And this is a kitchen at Harmon Plantation in Maryland. It's a small building set aside specifically to be a kitchen. And you see the large open fireplace, and that's where things were cooked. So it's very iffy as far as temperatures. Sometimes in some of these old colonial fireplaces, there'll be an oven set within the fireplace or to the side, like a little, usually it's about 2 feet by 2 feet area to try to bake. Some people did communal baking where they made a shared oven, which has a lot of things going for it because you can bake a lot of stuff in a medium-sized communal oven, and it saves on fuel and all that. So women were in charge of like storing the food, trying to preserve the food, and their options were pickling them or drying them, like green beans were dried, apples were dried, and fresh fruits and vegetables were just a seasonal kind of thing. So, and you can see here, I'm not sure if that's a laundry pot or if it's for cider or if they used it for both. I really don't know. This is Artemisia, known as mugwort in England, and it was an herb used for women's reproductive health issues. And I'm trying to think like for cramps or whatever, or in association with childbirth. So healers were typically women. Okay, you had midwives, male doctors were fairly rare, and even is now, Dr. Mom. It's the women were in charge of the medicine, and they used herbs. They adapted some from the indigenous people. They brought some over from England. They used ginger for GI upsets, chamomile to rinse their hair if it was blonde, peppermint, quote, quickened the brain, which actually they did a study and it does help you with your attention. So they were in charge of that sort of thing. And that made them vulnerable, especially the midwives, to complaints, charges of witchcraft. Okay. A lot of behavior was controlled by gossip. Okay. People would be unhappy. They would think somebody was like looking a glance at their husband or this and that. And if she was the midwife, then they might start like a gossip war and get her in trouble. And then the other people who were vulnerable to charges of witchcraft were single women. So spinsters and widows, widows had a fair amount of power because widows could own property. And that's one reason why you might want to be a widow as far as your legal stance, in that you would have a little more autonomy. But because of that autonomy, then they would be at risk for unfair charges. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this. So we did have issues with charges of witchcraft. The Connecticut witch trials started in 1647, Salem in 1692, and Maryland had witch trials from 1654 to 1712. In Maryland, 2 women were executed on ships heading to America. Sailors really get uncomfortable at times with women on ships, or at least they used to. They actually hanged a woman, Rebecca Fowler, in 1685 in Maryland. And all told, most of the data is that there are about 45 to 50 people who were executed as witches in the colonial time period. Several of them were men, but for the most part, they were women. So, this is another Copley portrait of a woman, and you can see she's wearing all the classic clothing of the times. You will notice they all had sleeves that stopped at the elbow, which was probably a way to save their clothing from getting soiled. She's got some birds, and it's just really pretty. So the women who came over here in colonial times, they did have an opportunity to live in a new world, an exciting world. They had some opportunities that they didn't have in Britain or England or Germany or wherever they were from, or in France. You know, it was because of the situation here, they could do things that they might not be able to do in the country of their origin. But there were definitely some tough times and some hardships. So I hope you found that interesting. And that's all I wanted to share right now. Thank you.